What does it take to create a world millions of people would rather live in than the one they were born into? And what kind of person has to exist behind that kind of magic? Before the arguments, before the headlines, before her name stopped meaning only wonder and started meaning division, JK, Rowling was a woman the world would come to describe in almost mythic terms. Broke, struggling, largely invisible, and somehow carrying an idea powerful enough to reorder childhood for an entire generation. That is where her story begins. Not in controversy, not in power, but in hunger. The kind that is never only about money, the hunger to matter, to survive, to build something so alive that it can outlast the life you are currently trapped inside. Rowling's early image became famous because it fit the shape people love most, the woman with very little, writing her way toward everything. A single mother, financial pressure, a manuscript moving through rejection after rejection, a world not yet listening. It is the kind of origin story people repeat because it feels almost too perfect, as if literature itself wanted a fairy tale about its own creation. But maybe that is what makes it dangerous. Because fairy tales are beautiful only until the person inside them refuses to remain simple. Long before she became a cultural empire, Rowling was building from instability. That matters. Not because hardship automatically creates genius, but because hardship teaches obsession. It teaches endurance. It teaches a person how to keep going when nobody is clapping, when nobody is promising there will be a reward at the end, when all you really have is the certainty that the thing inside your head feels more real than the room you are sitting in. And that may be the first secret behind Harry Potter. It was not invented from comfort, it was built from need. A boy under the stairs, a hidden world, a letter that changes everything. Why did that story hit so hard? Was it really just fantasy? Or was it something more intimate than that? The fantasy of being chosen after being overlooked, loved after being neglected, seen after living too long in emotional shadow. That is what Rowling understood, maybe better than anyone. She did not just write magic. She wrote rescue. She wrote belonging. She wrote the possibility that somewhere beyond humiliation, loneliness, and ordinary disappointment, there might still be a door waiting to open. And once that idea reached children, teenagers, and adults who were quietly desperate for exactly that feeling, the books stopped being books in the usual sense. They became shelter. That is why her rise felt so enormous. It was not simply commercial success, it was emotional colonization. Harry Potter spread across borders, languages, generations, schoolyards, bookstores, midnight lines, films, costumes, theme parks, and memory itself. Rowling was no longer only a writer, she was becoming the architect of an entire emotional universe. People did not just admire her imagination. They moved into it, they grew up inside it. They built identities around houses, spells, friendships, losses, and the moral structure of a world she had made feel almost more trustworthy than the real one. And once a writer reaches that level, something strange happens. The work stops belonging only to literature. The creator stops belonging only to herself. She becomes symbol, myth, cultural property. That is the first real turning point in Rowling's story. Not the publication, not even the success. But the moment her name stopped being attached to a series and started being attached to comfort itself, to nostalgia, to innocence, to the belief that stories can save people if they arrive at the right moment in life. And maybe that is why everything that came later hit so hard. Because when a woman gives the world a place to hide, the world starts expecting her to remain safe forever. But no one stays a refuge for millions without one day becoming a battlefield too. Success should have made everything easier. That is the lie people tell about stories like hers. Because once Harry Potter exploded, J.K. Rowling was no longer just a writer who had been rescued by her own imagination. She became something much bigger and much stranger, a person the world no longer wanted to see as ordinary. The books kept growing, the audience kept expanding. Children read them, adults defended them, critics took them seriously, studios saw a universe, publishers saw a phenomenon. And somewhere inside that acceleration, Rowling stopped looking like a woman who had written a beloved story and started looking like the woman who had built a cultural kingdom. That kind of ascent changes the relationship between creator and audience forever. At first, it feels like devotion. Then it starts to feel like ownership. Why? Because people were not just buying her books, they were building their emotional lives inside them. Hogwarts became more than a setting, it became memory, identity, ritual. A place people returned to when the real world felt colder, crueler, or harder to survive. And once a story becomes that important, the person who wrote it stops existing in public as a normal artist. She becomes attached to the comfort itself. The audience no longer sees only a novelist. It sees the keeper of a refuge. That is a dangerous kind of love, because the bigger Harry Potter became, the harder it became to separate J.K. Rowling from what the world needed her to represent. The books turned into films. The films turned into a visual mythology people could wear, quote, collect, and inherit. Entire generations grew up with her voice somewhere near the center of their inner lives. She was not simply famous. She became one of those rare figures whose work feels stitched into people's childhoods so tightly that criticizing it begins to feel personal. And when a person reaches that level of cultural power, the question changes. It is no longer, did she write something great? It becomes, who gets to own what she made? And more dangerously, does the person who created the sanctuary still deserve to stand at the gate? That pressure was already building long before the world said it out loud. Because Rowling's rise was not only literary, it was imperial. Every new success made her feel less like an individual and more like an institution. And institutions are not loved the way artists are loved. They are defended, debated, watched for weakness, asked to carry symbolic weight far beyond what one person can realistically survive. The public wanted her to remain what the books had made it feel: warm, wise, morally clear, almost maternal in the way she seemed to guide millions of readers toward courage, friendship, and resistance against cruelty. But what happens when the woman behind the world is no longer content to remain only a source of comfort? That is where the story starts darkening. Because the higher Rowling rose, the less room there was for contradiction. The more the audience turned her into a guardian of childhood, the more unforgivable it would feel if the person herself ever became harder to love than the world she created. And by then, the problem was already built in. She was no longer just writing stories. She had become one. Then the world did what it always does when it can no longer control the meaning of a beloved myth. It turned on the person who made it. And maybe that was inevitable, because J.K. Rowling was never going to remain only a writer in the public imagination. She had become too central, too powerful, too emotionally embedded in people's lives for that. So when her comments about sex, gender, and trans identity began igniting outrage, the reaction was never going to feel like an ordinary celebrity controversy. It hit harder because the woman at the center of it was not just famous. She was attached to childhood, comfort, belonging, and moral clarity for millions of readers who had once trusted her stories to make the world feel safer. What happens when the person who wrote your refuge becomes the source of your discomfort? What happens when the woman who taught a generation to identify cruelty suddenly becomes, in the eyes of many, part of it? That is where the real fracture began. The backlash was not only political, it was emotional. Readers were not just disagreeing with Rowling, they were grieving her, arguing over her, defending her, rejecting her. Entire communities split in real time. Some saw her as a woman speaking truths she believed the world was too afraid to say. Others saw her as someone using immense power to target an already vulnerable community. And because the Harry Potter universe had always been tied so tightly to ideas of outsiders, misfits, and chosen families, The contradiction felt unbearable to many people. That is what made it explode. This was not just a debate about language, it became a war over ownership of meaning. Fans started asking whether the world she created could be separated from the woman who built it. Could Hogwarts still be home if its creator now felt hostile to some of the people who once found shelter there? Could the books remain magical if the name on the cover now carried dread, anger, or betrayal? And maybe the cruelest part is that there was no clean answer. Because Rowling did not vanish, she did not retreat into silence the way some public figures do when controversy becomes too loud. She kept speaking, kept posting, kept re-entering the conversation in ways that made the divide deeper, harder, and more permanent. With each new headline, the cultural argument around her grew less temporary and more structural. She was no longer just a writer people disagreed with. She became one of the most polarizing figures in modern pop culture, a woman whose name now triggered not nostalgia first, but conflict. That changes everything, because once a creator becomes that divisive, every return to the work becomes charged. Every adaptation, every anniversary, every reboot, every act of fandom turns into a question of allegiance. Are people celebrating the story, endorsing the woman, ignoring the damage, rescuing the art? The mythology stops feeling stable. It becomes contested territory. And that may be the darkest turn in Rowling's story. Not that she lost admiration, but that she turned a world built on belonging into a place where belonging itself now feels argued over. Once that happens, the magic does not disappear. It becomes war. What makes J.K. Rowling's story so impossible to resolve is that she was never just a writer. She became a world. And worlds are harder to forgive than people, because a person can disappoint you and still remain only one person. But when someone builds a universe that shaped your childhood, your imagination, your language of friendship, courage, exile, and belonging, disappointment does not stay private. It spreads through memory. It reaches backward. It stains things you thought were safe from time. That is why her story still feels unfinished. Not because the arguments are unresolved, they may never be resolved, but because the emotional split she created is now permanent. J.K. Rowling did something very few artists ever do. She made work so powerful that it outgrew literature and turned into inheritance. People did not just read Harry Potter, they passed it down, they wore it, quoted it, built versions of themselves around it. The books became ritual, identity, home. And once that happens, the creator is no longer just the person who made the thing. She becomes attached to what the thing meant when people needed it most. That is where the pain in her story lives. Because millions of people are no longer asking whether Rowling is talented. That question ended long ago. They are asking something far more uncomfortable. What do you do when the person who gave you a sanctuary becomes someone you no longer trust inside it? Do you leave? Do you stay? Do you separate the art from the artist? Do you protect the magic by pretending the name behind it no longer matters? Or do you accept that the magic was always tangled with the person who wrote it, and that loving the work will now always carry a shadow? Maybe that is the real ending. Not triumph, not downfall, not cancellation, not redemption. Something messier than all of them. Because Rowling was not erased. She was not silenced into cultural disappearance. If anything, she became more central to the argument, more impossible to ignore, more divisive. The same woman who once represented wonder for millions now represents fracture too. She can still be historic and polarizing, influential and resented, brilliant and unbearable to some people at the same time, and maybe that complexity is exactly why her story refuses to settle. The world keeps trying to simplify her, hero or villain, genius or bigot, creator or destroyer, protector of truth or source of harm. But the truth is more disturbing than any single label. J.K. Rowling became what happens when a cultural mother figure no longer belongs equally to everyone who once loved her. She became proof that stories can outlive comfort, that magic can survive while trust collapses, that a legacy can remain enormous even while its emotional meaning breaks apart in public. And maybe that is why her story still burns. Because the books are still there, the memories are still there, the love is still there for many people, so is the anger. Nothing disappeared, it only split. And perhaps that is the cruelest fate for someone who once gave the world a place to belong, not to be forgotten, but to remain unforgettable in a way that never feels safe again.